further ado, let me take you into my presentation. So I'll be speaking about domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago and looking at protective rights and international treaty obligations. And to set the context in your mind, I'll be sort of guiding the discussion in terms of the international and domestic law that pertains to Trinidad and Tobago on domestic violence, sharing some trends in domestic violence pre and during the COVID-19 situation, and also explaining a bit about some of the policies that relate to domestic violence protection. In case you're not sure where Trinidad and Tobago is located, I have an insert, a global insert. So I'm in the little box. I'm currently broadcasting from Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a twin island republic. So country facts, as you can see on the screen, it's just twice the size of Oxfordshire in the UK. If you're based in the UK, 1.4 million is the population. Post-colonial British society, republic since 1976. We belong to the common law jurisdiction. We have a written constitution, and we are a member of the UN. And because we're a member of the UN, we are signatories to many conventions, protocols, treaties. I've identified just one or two on the screen with the ratification date. So Convention on the Rights of the Child, which you may know, it's flagging protection against neglect, cruelty, and exploitation. Also, all of the conventions in the preamble would be flagging the dignity of the person, the enjoyment of freedom from fear. And all of these aspects will be protective rights which are enshrined in the constitutions, which are enshrined in domestic law in Trinidad and Tobago, and enforced as policies by various agencies. So we know the sort of emergence of protection against domestic violence, and I have tracking from the Economic and Social Council resolution of 1991 and moving forward to the elimination of violence against women. Now, is international law adequate when we look at local domestic violence needs? Well, we know that from the perspective of the UN, perhaps it is felt by the lobbyists and the NGOs who prepare various reports for the UN agencies. Perhaps it is felt that the prior protocols, documents, treaties didn't particularly directly speak to the issue of domestic violence. And therefore, the UN General Assembly in 2019 decided to link the whole idea of the prohibition of torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment to the whole issue of domestic violence. So in my view, I felt that this was a good move, mainly because it now became this whole idea of cruel, degrading treatment is bringing forth the issue of a non-derogable right that persons are entitled to. So it can be viewed as a progressive step, yet some academic writers, as seen on the screen, they suggest that these statements are non-binding. And therefore, one can imagine that a sovereign state can therefore say, well, depending on resources, depending on if gender is on the agenda of the policies of a country, these recommendations and so on will be implemented. So, it's not as binding as a treaty per se. Now, what is the problem in Trinidad and Tobago with regards to the nature and incidence of domestic violence? So, trawling through some of the writings, we have police data suggesting that between 2010 and 2015, we had approximately 11,441 reports of domestic violence. I do introduce a caveat here, as we do, and criminologists will acknowledge as well, that reported cases could be underreporting of the true nature of the problem. Some persons might be fearful of going to the authorities. So while these are reported incidents, the problem could be larger than what is known. Nevertheless, using the known data, we could say that 75% of the reports related to females, and that a lot of these resulted in lethal violence. And 56% of those domestic homicides, victims were female. So you can trawl through and see some of the issues there. So the hotlines are also saying that primarily they're female victims. And of course, hotline would be those who are reporting, and it might be underreported for other groups. So for example, homosexuality is criminalized in Trinidad and Tobago. So one would imagine that such persons would not necessarily publicize their status or publicize offenses against the person. Looking at our Domestic Violence Act of 1999, we take a broad view: financial, psychological, physical abuse, as you can see in Section 3. So have a little read of Section 3 and you can see the way that it is framed. I've also noticed, because currently, at least for the past 3 months, we had a sort of spike in the pre-COVID situation before the stay-at-home orders came into effect. We had a little spike in domestic homicides, and these were partners and ex-partners stalking the others and using gun violence in public. So there was that particular concern. And it is good to see that Section 3, subsection B of that Domestic Violence Act sort of suggested an inference to stalking without labeling it stalking. It was really the following of a person and so on. So I sort of attribute it as stalking behavior. And the purpose of the Act really is to provide injunctive relief to victims and to ensure prompt and legal remedy to the victims of domestic violence. So can this adequately meet the needs in a modern society? Because it is known now with additional data that women and girls can experience different types of violations. As I mentioned before, persons in the non-heterosexual relationships might be fearful of bringing to the attention of the authorities their status and their victimization experience. We do have the courts ruling for protective rights to a certain extent in Jones versus the Attorney General 2018. And what do we make of the forms of domestic violence not covered in the 1999 Act, such as cyber abuse by intimate and former intimate partners, increasingly revenge porn, defamation on social media is beginning to emerge. What do the reports say about meeting the targets? Well, it is suggested that rape of men and women, including spousal rape, is illegal and punishable. However, there's a caveat to that, in the sense that when one looks at the actual data, very few persons have been given these sentences. So yes, it might be on statute, but again, when we look at the conviction data, then that tells a different story. We know that rape and domestic violence are pervasive, so even pre-COVID 19, it was an issue. And you can see some of the data on the screen. We are pleased to see that there is agency support, crisis hotlines, support from the police, shelters, psychosocial services offered by state and NGO actors. So it made me reflective in terms of, did COVID-19 confinement increase domestic violence incidents? Well, the UN is suggesting that it did, globally that is, and that somehow it became a shadow pandemic. So while it was known that violence against women and girls increased over the last 12 months, with that staggering figure of 243 million, it is also being suggested that the number is increasing. So generally where my arrow is pointing, emerging data shows that since the outbreak of COVID-19, violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified. So there is some indication that the problem is stark and perhaps global. And it is also suggesting that the stay-at-home orders is putting people it's affecting domestic violence in two ways. So persons might be in confinement with the known perpetrators, so they are vulnerable on two accounts. One, in confinement with a perpetrator without any alternative shelter, and two, the fact that they can't go out from home to access resources. Nevertheless, emerging technologies are there to support. So a lot of digital technologies, online counseling, hotlines, and so on, that's being opened up to accommodate persons in need. So there are, for example, explanations. So I've drawn upon my psychological background in cognitive psychology to suggest why is there this increase. It's not only confinement, it's not only medical via COVID-19, but we also have as a theory the frustration aggression hypothesis. And this states that frustration increases arousal and anger, so it can lead to aggression. However, this is not a hard and fast rule, and social learning theory comes into play. So, for persons who can regulate their emotions, who have better control mechanisms, they do not necessarily have to become aggressive, even if they are frustrated. But we do know that persons in confinement over several weeks with uncertainty may have challenges managing their conflict. There might be the encroachment of privacy, having to share a small space. There might be conflict, having to share limited resources. So all of these, we believe, can generate tension, can escalate into perhaps aggression and maybe violence. But this is speculative. As you said, there's no hard and fast rule, and we're simply seeking explanations. We can also look towards post-traumatic stress disorder as an explanatory factor. This is an anxiety disorder. Who might be suffering from anxiety or PTSD in the COVID world? Well, the frontline workers, the first responders, those attending to COVID-19 patients, those who are bereaved, and all of these are happening quite suddenly. And so persons don't have the coping mechanisms. So the diagnostic manuals are suggesting that traumatic events, and most persons have said COVID-19 is a trauma, can precede the onset of PTSD. And symptomology could be intrusive thoughts, fear and horror, and again, the inability to regulate emotions will alter behavior, potentially leading to interpersonal conflict. So again, the vulnerable in this case will be those who cannot regulate their emotions. They don't have good coping skills or good support services. So earlier on, I alluded to the fact that domestic violence is a problem in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Commissioner of Police is saying how it has escalated in the COVID world. So he was suggesting recently at a press conference on April 9th, 2020, that there was an increase in the reports of assaults, and you can see the figure on the screen, increasing last year from 39 to February of 2020 to 73. So, almost twofold. Looking at the numbers of reports of domestic violence increasing from 2019 to 2020, and a rise in domestic violence cases. So almost a doubling of all of those points that he mentioned between last year and this year. So clearly, if we have to ask ourselves the question, is there a global increase? Yes, according to UN, it's called a shadow pandemic. Is there a national increase in Trinidad and Tobago? Yes, according to the Commissioner of Police. So we have some other novelties emerging in response to the novel coronavirus. It has plus and negatives, and the plus would be we have all very quickly learned to get legislation ongoing in the interest of public health. We have agency support coming on stream very quickly. So part of the early release of prisoners to have social distancing in the prisons meant that there's some categories of prisoners who qualify for early release, and these are stated on the screen. With the early release, we needed to monitor those who are being released because there was a concern with the domestic violence perpetrators and victims. How do we protect them if persons are returning to the household? But also, there's a new twist to this electronic monitoring. The authorities in Trinidad and Tobago believe it could be used on victims to monitor their location and ensure their safety. Traditionally, we think of the perpetrators being surveilled, but here's a different twist. And we are thinking of revising our domestic violence legislation. There's a proposal to have virtual courts. So these domestic violence protection orders, there can be a link up from the police station to the virtual court. So bypassing the long-winded approach that it will take for a person who needs an emergency protection order. The judiciary is also stepping up a scheme to have hotlines for domestic violence filings. So essentially, this is what I wanted to share with you. To recap, I explained some of the international and local laws. I shared some trends. I outlined COVID-19 policies and laws.